Well, welcome everybody. I'm Carol Bell, one of the founder directors of Chapter Zero, and it's my pleasure today to chair this session, which we've arranged in collaboration with Emperor. As you will all know, Chapter Zero is a directors climate forum, and over the past 2 years, we've built a community of non-executive directors who share our ambition to lead crucial UK boardroom discussions addressing climate risk. Our 1,500 and more members are helping ensure that their companies are preparing to act, such that global net zero ambitions are transformed into robust plans and measurable action. Obviously, we offer our members tailored events such as this one, but also toolkits and relevant curated information. But perhaps more than anything, we've created a peer network to draw on case studies, best practice, inspiration, and ideas. Now, our topic today is how to plan ahead for new requirements in climate disclosure in annual reporting. It's a measure of the interest in the topic that more than 200 of you have registered to join us today, which is fantastic. And specifically today, we'll explore what can we learn from the 2020 annual report season and what can we expect by way of change in the current year. The 2020 annual reports of UK companies already marks a step change in disclosure of ESG considerations generally and climate risk specifically. And with mandatory TCFD reporting expected across all parts of the economy by 2025, today we'll address the practical considerations non-executive directors need to bear in mind about climate reporting and disclosure over the next few years. And in this discussion, I'm delighted to be joined by three highly qualified speakers. Phil Fitzgerald, the Director of the Financial Reporting Council's Financial Reporting Lab, will give us the regulator's perspective on planning ahead and climate and annual reporting. Phil will be followed by Claire Fraser, Head of Stakeholder Reporting and partner at the consulting firm Emperor. And our third presenter will be Leah Ramutar, Head of TCFD implementation at the Phoenix Group, who will share her hands-on experience of implementing this with us. Now, each speaker's presentation will be followed by a short question and answer session, but we'll have time for more questions at the end after all three speakers have given their presentations. And I very much hope that you will submit your questions in the Q&A function so that I can pick them up and we can address them as fully as possible today. And I'd just like to say at the outset as well that our three speakers have very kindly agreed to share their presentations with us afterwards. So that might help with the scribbling part of the exercise that I find myself in when I attend such events. So that no need to copy out things. You will get the slides afterwards. So without further ado, let's turn to our first panelist, Phil Fitzgerald. So Phil, please give us your regulatory perspective here, which I'm sure will be of great help to all of us.
Thank you very much, Carol. And perhaps while the slides are being brought up, I'd just like to open by congratulating Chapter Zero on such a fantastic initiative and really bringing the boardroom discussion into this, which is of course a very important place to start when considering the impact of climate change on businesses. I wanted to open very quickly and run through and provide a regulatory perspective. But perhaps before doing that, I just wanted to set out a little bit about what the FRC has been focusing on over the last 3 years. The FRC's focus is clearly on reporting and disclosure as well as governance. And over the last 3 years, we've very much been focusing on the impact of climate change on governance and reporting. 3 years ago, in the Financial Reporting Lab, which is the part of the FRC that I head up, we started a project to find out from investors what they're looking for from reporting from companies in relation to climate change. And we issued a report at the end of 2019, November 2019, which is a long report packed full of examples of emerging practice. But essentially that report concluded on two things really that investors were looking for in climate reporting. One was that almost unanimously they supported the TCFD requirements, and we're going to talk quite a bit about TCFD during the course of this presentation. And the second thing was that they also really encouraged companies to consider how climate change impacted on the financial statements. So we often find when we're reviewing annual reports that there's quite good narrative description in the front half of an annual report, but often it's not properly reflected in the financial statements or the implications on the financial statements. So those were two things that we very much heard as part of that first project that we started off 3 years ago. We then, having done that project, there was a lot of interest in it and a lot of further discussion about, well, what are the existing requirements on companies for reporting in terms of environmental reporting and reporting on climate change. And we wanted to do a follow-up to that initial report to really, which was a more sort of regulatory follow-up, if you like, to see if companies were already complying with the existing requirements, because of course TCFD is still voluntary at the moment. I'll talk in the moment about how it's going to become mandatory going forward, but there are a number of existing requirements which I've got on this slide. So the requirement to report on how the company is having an impact on the environment it operates in within the non-financial reporting statement, the newly introduced section 172 statement, which was brought in 2 years ago, but requires companies to set out how the directors have fulfilled their responsibilities to promote the success of a business, but having had regard to its stakeholders, including the environment. The streamlined energy and carbon reporting requirements, which were updated for the first for this year, and require companies to report on scope 1 and 2 emissions. The Corporate Governance Code, of course, was updated in 2018 with very much a focus on how companies could consider their sustainability over a long-term period and how boards should focus on that in their board discussions. And then finally, last but very much not least, the requirements in financial reporting requirements, the IFRS requirements. The ISB published a very good briefing note on this last year, which set out how financial reporting should reflect some of the issues related to climate change, and we're really encouraging companies to have a look at that briefing note and reflect it in their financial statements. So the FRDC did a broader review of compliance against these requirements, and that thematic review was published at the end of last year in November. And that set out a number of considerations for boards, for companies, for auditors, and others. I'm going to, at the end of this presentation, I'm going to provide a few links to some of these things. There's an awful lot in these reports, but what I've tried to do is pick out those things that are particularly relevant to you as board members, to enable you to question the executive within your companies and see if these things are being considered. And then I also wanted to talk about forthcoming requirements. As I said, TCFD is currently voluntary to adopt. The FRC encourages companies to adopt TCFD on a voluntary basis at the moment. But at the end of this year, the FCA are bringing in a requirement to report on TCFD for premium listed companies, and they're currently consulting on extending that requirement to standard listed companies. So we'll be seeing that mandatory requirement being implemented for December year ends this year. The government is also consulting on a TCFD requirement for large companies, so that will bring in large private companies and AIM quoted companies as well, meeting the size criteria. That's under consultation at the moment. The consultation is closed, and we're expecting a response from the government shortly as to how that might be implemented. And the government has published a roadmap, which has been mentioned earlier, leads to the majority of companies requiring to report under TCFD by 2025. Of course, there's also developments at the IFRS Foundation, the proposal to set up the International Sustainability Standards Board that has put in place a very ambitious timetable to produce sustainability standards, or the first set of standards focusing on climate, to have that in place next year. And the FRC has recently written to support the development or the establishment of that Sustainability Standards Board. Of course, as well as looking at climate change, that will look at other aspects of sustainability, such as the workforce, customers, suppliers, etc. And then as I mentioned earlier, the ISB has published a briefing note on the applicability of climate change to financial statement considerations, which we'll send a link to after this session. In terms of what the FRC has issued, as I said, the Financial Reporting Lab issued a report with practical guidance, lots of examples on companies who have started to implement TCFD. That was issued in November 2019. And the climatic thematic review, which was a more regulatory review, was issued in November 2020. But that also includes further practical examples of companies where we've seen good practice emerging. So both of those are very useful in terms of seeing what other companies are doing, looking at what best practice is, and identifying what investors are looking for. If I could go to the next slide, please. The next 3 slides are actually something that we published when we issued the original Financial Reporting Lab report, but I think they're still very relevant in terms of governance. This is actually a one-page document that we issued at the same time we issued the lab reports, but unfortunately, because it's issued in portrait rather than landscape, it doesn't fit onto one slide. So I'm going to put it on 3 slides, but I'll send you the link to the one-page summary. And this really is, different companies are at different stages in terms of thinking about climate change and thinking about TCFD implementation. So this is a bit of a roadmap, and depending on where your company fits will depend on where you are on the roadmap. So the starting point is to identify what arrangements does the board have in place for assessing and considering climate related issues? So what's the current position? What is the board already looking at? And that also it involves the company having a look at its business model, having a look at its strategy, and seeing whether climate change related factors are considered as part of that. Where are the assets? Are they likely to be affected by things like flood or excessive heat or so forth? What's the current position that company's in? And what's the board's view of the climate change challenge, and what assumptions is it making to form that view? What are its customers saying? What's happening in the supply chain? Really identifying that kind of, asking those initial simple questions around, where are we positioning ourselves as a company? And then the second thing is to identify, who has responsibility in the organization for climate related issues. Does it go to the board? Is there a separate committee? What arrangements does the executive committee or other divisionals have in place for assessing and considering climate related issues, and who takes responsibility for those? And then what information does the company hold? So what information does it have about carbon emissions, about the products that it's buying from suppliers? What information can it kind of pull together in thinking about its strategy? Then the next one is risk. Very important to understand both the risks and the opportunities that climate change presents. So what's the risk to the company's business model, but also what are the opportunities in producing low carbon products, for example, or other opportunities that might arise. If I could go to the next slide, please. Then focusing on, well, we've identified what information we've got as an organization, but what other information and metrics does the board need to be able to properly monitor climate-related issues? So what's kind of missing, if you like, in the setup? Then reviewing. So how does the board kind of monitor and oversee climate-related goals and targets? Many companies are setting net zero targets, but what is the board doing to monitor the progress of a company towards those net zero targets from year to year? Has the board reviewed its public policy approach to climate-related issues? So what is it saying publicly about this? And then how is the board preparing for different outcomes? What are the different scenarios that the company's looking at, and how that's affecting the company's strategy? Then in terms of going back to the metrics and data being used to monitor and manage the relevant issues, what kind of comfort is the board getting over those metrics? Is it subject to, are they subject to external assurance? What about internal audit, etc.? Next slide, please. And then finally, of course, having done all of that, the board and the company needs to decide what to disclose. How are we going to put this in annual reports? And I know Claire's going to talk about this later, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. And finally, what skills and competence does the board and the organisation as a whole need to be able to address the challenges climate-related issues pose. So that's a sort of one-page sort of route map, if you like, that the board might want to consider where you are on the route map, and what needs to be put in place to really properly consider these climate-related issues. I said I'd just highlight some key resources. There's a lot out there. There's a lot that the TCFD themselves published and a lot that the FRC has published. But I want to just end this presentation by just setting out 3 things that I think are particularly relevant for you to consider. If I could go to the next slide, please. So firstly, the government's roadmap, which is in the centre of this slide, which I've just run through. Secondly, the FRC, when it issued its climate thematic, it was actually 5 separate reports, one for each sort of category of people that might be interested in the topics. So one for boards, one for reporters, one for auditors, professional bodies, etc. But that's all summarized into one climate thematic report. It's about 15 pages long and summarizes the key things that you might think of as a board to ask whether those things are in place. So I'd very much highlight that. And then finally, from the original lab report on the left-hand side, we published a list of questions for companies to ask themselves and how that would link to their reporting. And those are broadly categorized around the 4 TCFD pillars. So there's one set of questions for each of the 4 pillars, and again, that's quite a useful tool for boards to use to see if the company is really on top of all of this. So I thought that would be useful just to highlight those 3 things. As I say, there's a lot of resources out there, but those 3 areas are perhaps the places to start for boards to consider. Well, I'd like to thank Chapter Zero again for the opportunity to present to this. I hope you found that a useful presentation, and please do send me any questions either during this session or afterwards. Carol.
Thank you very much, Phil. Absolutely fascinating insight. And thank you on behalf of all the NEDs for picking out those things that are very relevant to us as board members, and showing us the route map, which I think is incredibly helpful. Clearly, there's a lot for companies and their boards to think about. What advice would you give them on how to make a start on assessing the impact of climate change on their reporting?
Well, I think for me, it goes back to that point about asking some very simple questions at the start. You know, first of all, looking at where the company operates, where its assets are. You know, are there any risks to those assets? You know, if you've got assets which might be in an area subject to flooding or so forth. You know, the kind of physical risks that the company might be exposed to. And then to look at the company's business model and say, well, what products are we producing? You know, are they high carbon products, or you know, can we do anything to reduce that, and start thinking about the company's strategy around that. And then looking at, well, what are the company's customers saying? What are they looking for in relation to how the company's responding to climate change? What about the supply chain? How far does that go? You know, and do I know how much impact on the climate that's, or the local environment that's having? So it's kind of starting off with those questions around the company's business model, around where its assets are located. And then thinking about how to, you know, gather the information that we need to be able to make strategic decisions to address some of the risks and challenges that arise from that, and opportunities as well.
Yeah, I think this question of making a start is something that I feel very, very strongly about. I've said this before in Chapter Zero events. There's an old Welsh proverb, which in English it goes something like, "You're 2/3 of the way there the minute you make a start." And that is really, really true. There seems to be an activation energy here towards making that start. But Phil, your presentation has given people an excellent summary that's very focused for NEDs on where to make a start. So thank you very much. We'll be coming back to you at the end with more questions. So
thank you.
Thank you very much. So now can we turn to Claire Fraser, please, from Emperor, who is going to share with us some recent research on FTSE 350 TCFD implementation. And it's always important when you're a non-executive director to make sure that your assumptions are grounded in reality. And therefore, thank you, Claire, for sharing with us your research on this question.
Thank you, Carol. Now, can I just check quickly that you are seeing a new set of slides?
You are.
Perfect. Got to just make sure that these technical things work before we launch into a tirade. So good afternoon and thank you very much for having me along. Phil has actually neatly set me up to segue into disclosure, so thank you, Phil. And just very briefly, by way of context, Emperor works with over 400 listed and non-listed companies across the UK and Europe. We provide corporate and sustainability reporting services and advice, specifically in relation to narrative reporting. So as Carol said, last year we conducted in-depth research and analysis of climate disclosures across the FTSE 350. And we found that over half of companies either provided no or low quality information on the impact of climate change. We updated this research in April to see how companies are progressing, and there's been a notable shift in the number of companies who are now talking about climate change as the biggest threat of our time. Many companies talk about how the pandemic has shone a light on the rapid impact of external events. So over the past year, we've seen the biggest shifts in 4 areas: ownership of climate risk, governance and oversight, commitments, and risk management. For most companies, the CEO now has ultimate responsibility for climate risk. This is a notable change from our previous research, where accountability often sat with the CSR, sustainability, or risk team. We're also seeing more evidence of companies establishing climate-focused board or subcommittees and appointing non-executive directors with specific climate experience. So over half of companies now have a dedicated subcommittee for sustainability. Those without subcommittees identified other changes to help boards get to grips with sustainability issues. So for example, SEGRO and International Workplace Group have designated responsibility for sustainability issues to a specific non-exec director. Anglo-American appointed a new non-exec director to the board with specific experience in developing clean energy strategies. We're also seeing more companies appointing a chief sustainability officer or an equivalent executive sponsor. And a number of companies also discussed additional steering and working groups at an operational level. Most companies have announced some sort of net zero commitments, but we found that the ambition, timeframes, and robustness of those strategies varied wildly. In some cases, sustainability is being considered on a par with business strategy. However, we did notice that about 16% of companies still do not have a sustainability strategy. I'll come back to that strategy point a bit later. On the risk management front, we found a notable difference between companies discussing climate change as a principal risk. Just over half of companies talk about climate change as a principal risk, versus 12% who still refer to it as an emerging risk. Nearly a third do not identify climate change in their risk section at all. And a small number of companies describe the impact of climate change across their entire risk register. So in our view, the general quality of climate disclosure tends to reflect where companies are on their journey. Those who've been factoring in climate-related risks and opportunities for years are well ahead. Those who are only just getting to grips with it tend to be lagging. However, we are seeing more companies taking steps to improve their internal processes, oversight, and accountability, which is promising. So as Phil mentioned, since the FCA confirmed its expectation for premium listed companies to disclose in line with the TCFD from the 1st of January this year, unsurprisingly, this has driven a rapid uptake, with 36% of companies adopting the recommendations in 2020. That's compared to 28% who have been disclosing for 1 year, 24% who've been disclosing for the past 2 years or more, and 15% who still aren't talking about TCFD at all. So outside of financial services and the extractive industries, we actually found a surprisingly high number of FTSE 100 companies who only adopted the TCFD recommendations last year. We found that surprising because globally, other markets have been championing alignment for several years now. But we did see that those companies who had adopted the recommendations in 2020 on the whole were making a concerted effort to put the right systems and processes in place. So just very briefly on, in terms of where that TCFD disclosure appears, primary location tends to be the annual report. The majority of companies provide additional or supplementary information, either on the website or in a sustainability report. We find that more established reporters, particularly in the banking sector and the mining industry, often produce a standalone climate, TCFD or transition report. Only 12% of companies use their sustainability report as the primary location, and we did observe that there was often a duplicate or replica of information between the annual report and the sustainability report, which does raise questions about the purpose of annual versus sustainability reporting, particularly where information is financially material. Just a note about frameworks in general. It's becoming increasingly common for companies to disclose against sustainability frameworks in their annual report. 80% of companies refer to alignment with one or more frameworks. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the most common frameworks are SASB and GRI, alongside industry-specific frameworks. We've seen an increased uptake of SASB since advocates like BlackRock have started encouraging companies to look at that as a framework. The TCFD recommendations have been incorporated into the CDP, which is still the most common supplementary framework for climate disclosures. And we did find that only 28% of companies discuss alignment with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And only half of those do so in the annual report. So again, that raises some questions about how much attention some of these broader topics are being given at exec and board level. So if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. The old adage that means strategy, metrics and targets inevitably go hand in hand. As I mentioned, most companies have set a net zero commitment. However, the timeframes vary from 2025 to 2050. Around a third of companies are targeting net zero by 2030 versus 20% who are targeting net zero by 2050. And we found that leaders have developed ambitious net zero strategies. Some are aligning to science-based carbon reduction commitments as well. Phil touched on this in terms of the impact of climate disclosure on the financials. So 20% of companies disclose information on scenario analysis across a range of short, medium to long-term timeframes. And just to emphasize what Phil said earlier, we don't believe the financial impact of climate-related risks and opportunities is widely understood yet. We've seen around a third of businesses communicate around financial impact, but only 11% have quantified the impact on the financial statements. Scenario analysis and quantification of climate risk is obviously the most challenging aspect of TCFD because the time horizons are looking 10 to 20 years out, but it is something that investors and other stakeholders are looking for. On metrics and targets, beyond mandatory requirements, we found that climate-related metrics varied across companies and sectors. Forward-thinking companies in financial, energy, mining, and the built environment sectors have a variety of approaches that include scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and energy reductions, energy efficiency measures, and green energy usage and investments. We also found carbon offsetting schemes being used by companies who are aiming to offset a proportion or all of their remaining emissions. And I just wanted to end with a couple of specific examples and points of reference that I hope will be useful. AstraZeneca, Barclays, and Standard Chartered have all made tangible commitments in terms of the investment they're planning to make over the coming years. Those are just a couple of examples that we picked out in terms of that research, but it's very much about facilitating that transition. AstraZeneca in particular launched an ambitious zero carbon strategy last year, which is focused on eliminating emissions by 2025 and being carbon negative by 2030. And that includes a number of interrelated work streams and emissions around scope 1, 2, and 3, but also working with the supply chain as well to try and drive that behavior and that collaboration further down the supply chain. In terms of partnerships, engagement and initiatives, we saw some encouraging examples of companies who are focusing on partnerships and collaborations to help them achieve progress, especially around Scope 3 emissions in supply chains. We saw a lot of companies who'd enhanced their membership of organisations who are advocating for climate action, and several companies who undertook direct engagement with key stakeholder groups and influencers, including Climate Action 100. And progress is often demonstrated through unique activities in disclosure. So just one example, Lloyds Banking Group identified TCFD as a key board activity by the Risk Committee. They also discussed actions and progress in a Q&A with the Responsible Business Committee chair. So all of these, tangible examples of progress help move away from boilerplate disclosure and help people to understand the company's approach and performance. In terms of time horizons, Agreco were one of the FTSE 100 who adopted the TCFD recommendations last year, but they were able to provide some useful insights into their short, medium and long-term considerations, particularly around the energy transition. So some really useful insight in terms of the things that they are considering and discussing at exec and board level. And finally, in terms of quantifying risks and opportunities, so Phil and I have both mentioned that quantification of impact on the financial statements is the piece that's often lacking. But there are a couple of companies who are doing this quite well at the moment. So Mondi disclose the financial impact of both risks and opportunities. They also talk about actions in place, looking at physical and transitional risks, how regulatory changes and water stress are going to impact financial performance. They talk about opportunities that they're able to capitalize on, so cost reductions and savings, but also efficiency measures that they're putting in place which are going to benefit the business in the long term. SSE are also another good example of really quantifying those risks and opportunities in monetary terms. And without further ado, that's a whistle-stop tour of what we are seeing in the market at the moment.
Well, Claire, that is a whistle-stop tour and an awful lot to take in. So I'm very grateful to you for sharing the slides afterwards. One of the things that strikes me is to think about the next reporting cycle. You've gone through the past one. You've given us a good snapshot of where people are on that journey. What's your key takeaway or observation for board committees and executive teams to keep in mind as they prepare for the next reporting cycle and the next annual report?
Yeah, so I'm a very firm believer that reporting and disclosure is an output of progress and performance and activities that have been happening within the business. So the roadmap that Phil just walked you through, in terms of all the things that a business has to put in place that then leads to a piece of disclosure. I would say, as someone who's been following the evolution of TCFD and climate disclosure in general for the past couple of years, I found it quite interesting how much progress and momentum has been achieved in the past 6 months. So I would say the really important thing is that internal cross-function collaboration, particularly because there are so many interdependencies around climate change, risk and opportunity, touches on many other aspects of sustainability. So I think for board members in particular, I'd be questioning the exec in terms of those cross-function collaborations. And Lee's going to talk a bit more about her experience. But it's a really good example of how, that engagement, partnership, collaboration is so important if you're going to drive change.
I completely agree with that. I tried to map out who needed to cooperate in one of my companies, and it turned out pretty quickly like a mosaic diagram. This is an area where it's not the chief financial officer and his team running through a checklist to get things together, and to get it right and to integrate it into strategy involves many more people on the executive team across the business. So
absolutely.
I'm sure we'll be coming back with more questions, Claire, but thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
And so now we come to what I know will be a highlight for Chapter Zero members, because every piece of feedback we get from you tells us that you like hearing from people who've got a bit further down the road on the journey than you may have done. And that's one of the great joys of Chapter Zero, is to share best practice. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Leah from the Phoenix Group to tell us how her journey went so far and maybe how it's likely to go in the future. Thank you, Leah.
Thank you, Carol, and good afternoon, everyone. So today I will do my best to sort of give some insight into how Phoenix Group as an organization, we've approached the exercise, and in particular, what's been our experience so far in terms of adopting the TCFD framework. So if we kind of move on to the next slide, the first question that obviously many of you probably ask is why do we adopt the framework? And probably there's three key reasons I wanted to highlight for this. So the first reason, we are obviously we're the largest sort of long-term savings and retirement business. We've got sort of over 338 billion assets under administration, and we kind of really felt that we had a duty as an organization to ensure that those assets were invested in a sustainable manner, which is very much in line with our recent sort of refreshed corporate strategy to ensure that sustainability was at the heart of our business. The second reason was basically the sort of, I guess, increased pressure. We started to get a lot more increasing interest from our shareholders, from our regulators, and a number of other stakeholders who really wanted to know how we were progressing in this area, what was our position, not just around climate and climate risk, but sort of broader ESG issues. And we really wanted to make sure that we had the answers to those questions, and we were kind of informed from a sort of decision-making position to address this issue. And finally, I think when we adopted the framework, which is obviously interesting to see kind of, the take up in 2020 was quite a significant one, because that's when we as an organization supported formally the framework. I think at the time, around 60%, I think I read, of the 100 largest sort of public companies were supporting the TCFD. So we very much felt this is obviously, a solid framework. It's very comparable, and, it was moving towards a mandatory disclosure. So we kind of felt that we needed to kind of join the market and support it. In terms of kind of the first key steps we completed, I think that one of the first key things is kind of making sure that we had that executive sponsorship at the senior level. We were able to get our sort of chief risk officer, but also our chief financial officer to co-sponsor this project. And that was really quite critical, because it sort of got the focus right at the senior level. But because they were an executive team, they were able to engage with all the other members of our executive committee. We created a new role, so that was sort of my role, head of TCFD implementation, which is really around coordinating sort of activity, delivering the implementation. But I think it's sort of, we felt it as a framework, we sort of quickly realized it sort of touched across all parts of the organization. So everyone needed to be involved, but there needed to be sort of that central point of ownership with that role. And we quickly sort of mobilized a team of people to work on the project, again, across the organization. And we sort of really tasked ourselves to think about what our current governance structure was. Because we always felt that to kind of embed this successfully, our governance needed to be right, and it needed to be right from the start. So we undertook an exercise to kind of revisit our governance and see where we needed to enhance the structure and the framework to make sure that we address the climate risk and opportunity. So the diagram on the right, this is just an extract from our last TCFD disclosure. The four key things that we did in terms of enhancing that structure: we created a cross-functional working group, which I mentioned. The remit is about ensuring that sort of day-to-day implementation and the embedding of the recommendations. We also established a TCFD steering group. They are sort of mandated with making sure that they oversee the progress in terms of the project, and where we needed sort of key decisions to be made, that is the forum we normally use. At a wider level, actually, and quite importantly, we felt the need to establish a new board committee. So we also had the sort of traditional audit, risk, remuneration, and nomination committee. But again, because we felt sort of climate and wider sustainability really need to be escalated to kind of the top level from a strategic focus, we felt the need to establish this new board sustainability committee. And in line with that, when we were looking at the sort of the climate related oversight, we revisited all the terms of reference for the existing committees. And in particular, we looked at enhancing the terms of reference around the audit committee, the risk committee, and the remuneration committee to ensure that we had sufficient oversight around sort of climate related matters for the other board committees. So moving on to the next slide. I thought it'd be helpful, hopefully, to just touch on some of the sort of the key activities we undertook in the first couple of months, once we've had that initial sort of mobilization completed. And what was really important for us to understand is where we were positioned in terms of the management of climate risk and opportunity as an issue, but also our disclosure. We really needed to understand where we were positioned against our peers in terms of the wider marketplace. And really top on the list in terms of understanding that is we sort of did a bit of a gap analysis. So we looked at where we were, where we needed to be, both in terms of the requirements, both in, as well as the peer in the marketplace. And that really sort of helped inform the next steps, which is really around developing a roadmap and developing a bit of an implementation plan to get us sort of from A to B. And that implementation and roadmap and that plan, I always say it's a bit of the Bible of the project, really. We sort of refer to it on obviously a weekly basis. And I always find, when you're embarking on kind of a new activity across the board, to have those key milestones sort of formally documented, where you're thinking about your dependencies, you're thinking about the risk and issues, you've got the accountability. I think you're really sort of setting yourself up for success. And that's sort of been quite instrumental in terms of getting sort of mobilizing our work and moving things forward. We also completed some sort of foundation work, which was kind of our first phase of activity, which is really around the kind of the qualitative work around our scenario analysis. One key thing that we did, again, which we thought was really, really helpful, we did a bit of a heat mapping exercise. So we engaged with a number of stakeholders in the organization to really try to hone in on what were the kind of the most material areas of risk for us as a business, because it's useful to kind of see what everybody else is doing, but it really needs to be relevant to you as an organization. As we did that heat map where we looked at, areas across the business in terms of sort of low, medium, high in terms of materiality, and kind of the key output of that exercise that we recognized that for us, from an investment portfolio perspective, that was kind of an area of material risk, and that was an area that warranted a lot of focus and further resource too. So where we are now in terms of the second phase, we're building in all the preparatory work that we've done. We are, as an organization, we're involved in the climate ban, the CVES activity through the regulators. We're looking at quantification of our scenarios and building up the kind of metrics and targets framework, which we're looking to disclose next year. And more broadly, across the 4 pillars, we're basically getting all those actions done and implementing the plan that we developed early on at the start of this process. I think it's also useful to talk about challenges for those kind of embarking on this journey. From my understanding and having sort of spoken to quite a number of people in the market, I think the challenges we have are very similar to what the challenges that other people have. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is also a recurring theme. The first one I wanted to highlight is around resourcing. Unless you're an organization, potentially in the oil and gas sector and the mining sector, where you will focus on climate change very much as part of a key fundamental risk to your organization, a lot of the times, a lot of the organizations in financial services probably didn't sort of target that as a particular key principal risk. So they were not necessarily a sort of group of people who are ready to kind of take these recommendations and deliver it. So we had an issue around who was going to get involved in the process. Do we have enough people to focus their time and effort on this? It needs to be a focused effort. It can't be something that people do on the side of their desk. And related to the resourcing point is the technical expertise. Some of the work in particular around understanding the fundamentals of what is physical risk, what is transition risk, what are the scenarios that are out in the marketplace, the timeframes, how do you perform climate scenario analysis? Is a lot of, can be quite technical. And again, even though we had done sort of scenario analysis as part of sort of our BAU, the climate element of it was quite different. And how did we overcome that? We obviously started with, we didn't start with a very big team. We kind of got a few people together and we built the team as the work developed. And where we felt that we needed to get sort of an external view or an external consultant to help us, we engaged with that. Second challenge, again, I'm sure that every organization who's adopting TCFD will talk about the data, the climate data. Again, to help inform our scenario work and the work that we needed to do on the kind of metrics and development, we really need to start with a blank piece of paper. What internal data do we have? How easy is that to extract for the purposes? But more importantly, what additional data we need, because a lot of this climate data is not something that an organization would have as sort of standard data. So again, that was another area that we needed to look to sort of third-party specialist data providers to help us source the data that we needed to kind of deliver the recommendations. Just before I finish, I thought I'd touch on a few points in terms of what we've learned as an organization that I think is worth highlighting again for anyone who's kind of embarking on this journey. I think the senior stakeholder support and ownership upfront is very, very key. It's very critical to get this at the very top of the agenda. I would encourage people to don't wait, and obviously something that Carol and the others in the forum have mentioned, don't wait to kind of problem solve everything before you get started. There is a lot to do. Don't underestimate it. I think when you start delving into the detail, you realize the scale of the work to be done. So don't wait to kind of start to have all the answers before you get started. If you need external support in terms of technical expertise, secure it. I think what's worked well for us is at some point, the TCFD and the climate reporting needs to transition to business as usual. And we really need to kind of build up that internal capability, and having sort of some support at certain parts of a project to have that external review and validation, I think has been helpful from that perspective. And I encourage everyone to talk to their peers who are within the industry, who are who are in this journey with you, but also your wider industry forums. We are within insurance, we are very obviously closely connected to the ABI, and that has been an excellent kind of resource for us to get in touch with our peer group, problem solve, and share ideas and lessons learned as well. So I would encourage people to see it as something that needs to be a collaborative effort. Lots of organizations feel, there's a view that this needs to be a competitive, everyone's sort of, racing to net zero, but really it needs to be a collaborative effort. So I would encourage everyone to reach out to their peers and the wider industry forum. And then on that final note, probably sort of a key takeaway for the kind of the board members and the wider audience on this webinar, I would say that, and I think this has been echoed by Claire and Phil already, adopting the TCFD framework is really much more than a reporting and a compliance exercise. I think to really meet the intent of the recommendations and what the Financial Stability Report and the wider globe is trying to do is that the management of climate risk and opportunity really needs to be embedded within an organization to really meet the intent. And in particular, I think for organizations where TCFD will soon become mandatory, I would encourage boards and board committees to start asking questions of their companies, in terms of what their plans are, what they're doing, and start considering these issues now and these requirements now to help them with sort of discharging their responsibilities. So hopefully that was helpful. I will pause there and back to you, Carol.
Thank you very much, Leah. There's so much to take away there, and thank you very much for outlining it so clearly, especially the part with respect to the need to develop your own company's authentic materiality, if you like.
Yes.
It's good to look at what other companies are doing, but actually this is not something that anybody can take off the shelf, that it has to be specific to your own company. And you've raised some very interesting points as well about resourcing, I think, and having the right technical expertise, which, you know, is a real consideration for smaller companies. I know big organizations, you can harness the cross-functional skills that exist within your business. In smaller companies is going to be much more of a challenge, but nevertheless getting that sort of dimension is and materiality is very, very important. I just wanted to ask you, if I may, as we're running out of time, and as we've got a very vivid conversation going on in the Q&A and questions are being answered, I just wanted to ask you, Leah, on your last point, what are the key questions board committees should be asking of their executive teams as they start adopting the TCFD framework? What learnings have you got in that department?
Sure. Thank you, Carol. So I think I guess it depends on where an organization is on their journey. So I think if you're very much just you're approaching this with a blank piece of paper, I think the first question is, has the organization really undertook an exercise to understand and identify if there are any material climate related risks to their business? And have they disclosed this already? I think for an organization that's a little bit further along in the journey, you probably need to ask, okay, so you've identified this risk. What have you done to understand, you know, the gaps in terms of either your disclosure, in terms of your processes and systems, and do you have a plan? Do you have a plan to kind of address those gaps? And then for an organization probably is a little bit further along in the journey, I think the assurance piece is something, and this is probably more relevant probably for an audit committee. You know, what assurance do we need over the TCFD disclosure and broader systems and controls? Because I think early engagement with the auditors on this is a very useful tip, I think. And you know, I would encourage organizations to make sure they're thinking about that assurance piece that usually comes at the end, but is actually quite important to give the board the comfort that what's being delivered is to the quality it needs to be.
Well, thank you very much, Leah. Well, we've had such a wealth of presentations and such a wealth of information here that really, I think the questions are being answered in the Q&A session. So I'd just like to wrap up the session by saying thank you to our three speakers who've done such a tremendous job. I'm going to be asking them each one more thing. But really, I think the call to arms is there. If you're not on this journey, you need to get on it. And Leah's given us some very, very clear pointers about how to get on with that. Claire's given us an incredibly clear snapshot of what the last reporting season looked like and how the trends might start evolving from there, which is extremely helpful. And Phil has, of course, given us the regulatory background in a very, very clear way. But what I take away is this is not like any other form of disclosure that I've ever come across, and I've been working in companies since 1980, so that's a very, very long time. Everything else, one has been able to take a checklist off the shelf, take advice from the auditors, take advice from other professionals. But this is one where we really have to create the authentic map of our own company ourselves. We have to engage the senior executives, and that came through very, very clearly in what Leah had to say there. You need to have the senior executive sponsorship, but you also need the non-executive board alongside the executive sponsoring the level of analysis and the level of strategic integration that is required to deliver net zero. So it's a call to arms for all of us as non-executive directors. We've learned that some sectors are ahead of others for good reason, but it's not something that can be left any longer. We do need to get onto it. And what I would like to close with is to ask each of our panelists in order to give one thing that they think a non-executive director should be doing at this point in time to support effective climate reporting. So Phil, can we start with you, please?
I was going to steal the line that you said earlier, actually, Carol. You said getting started actually gets you 2/3 of the way there. I thought that was a brilliant line, and I think if there's one thing I would recommend is to get started, is to start asking questions of the company, to look at its business model, and kind of, you know, how that might need to transition to a kind of net zero strategy. You know, we've provided some resources in this which provides some questions that you can start which will help you start that journey and start asking those initial questions, and I would very much encourage you to use that. But get started, that's the key thing, Carol, as you said.
Yeah, but thank you very much, Phil. Claire.
Similar but different, I guess. There have been a few questions in the chat at the moment about, you know, the TCFD framework. Is it going to be absorbed into other frameworks, that sort of thing? And I think when you look at the landscape at the moment, the corporate and the sustainability reporting landscapes, you know, over the past 5 years, we have seen a 72% increase in regulations around stakeholders and sustainability. It's only going to grow. So to echo Leah, Phil, and your points, Carol, it's not about leaving it all to the last minute and waiting for that to become a mandatory requirement. It's about thinking in a long-term, sustainable way, trying to get on the front foot and position your business in such a way that is going to make it robust, credible, and a really solid investment proposition as well.
And I would add to that, if I may, Claire, that to create a company that people want to work for, because the workforce is an incredibly important part of all of this, and especially the younger members of the workforce, I have found personally. So Leah, last word to you.
Sure. Yeah, I echo everything I think the other panelists have said. I think the one thing I would say is that the NEDs, I think, need to recognize that this will take time. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. And, you know, integrated climate reporting, I think, is the end result. But I think the bigger objective is to make sure that climate considerations are really embedded within the decision-making of an organization. So I would encourage the NEDs to engage as much as possible and challenge the organizations to understand how are they going to ensure that this embedding is going to be addressed.
That's a very, very good point. And there's a question in the Q&A from an oil industry director, and Claire and I have answered it, and you've summed that up perfectly. It needs to be in the strategy. Without integrating it into the strategy, then we're not going to get there, basically. So disclosure is an output, but putting it centrally into the strategy is the key point. Well, thank you very much, fellow panelists. Absolutely excellent transfer of experiences, and indeed ready reckoners to help us ask the right questions and get ourselves on the road today. And I hope that all of our 120 or so, I think I saw at one point, of attendees from Chapter Zero have got as much out of this as I have. So thank you very much and goodbye.